Can you hear me now? Okay. Sure, it's good to be with y'all today. I really appreciate Dimitri finding me and inviting me to come talk to you. Really appreciate his initiative and his interest. This program will be mostly about the SR-71 Blackbird that I got to fly for 6 years. The SR-71 Blackbird was built in the early 1960s. Beautiful airplane, fascinating airplane. I think you'll enjoy learning some things about it. So, world's fastest, highest flying airplane, and its mission was to take pictures in hostile areas of the world. That's an artist depiction there. President Johnson announced its existence in 1964. I was 15 years old at the time. That's what I looked like when I was 15. And I thought, man, I'd like to fly that plane someday. And so flying the Blackbird was really a dream come true. So I'll tell you briefly how I got to fly the Blackbird. I went to Auburn University. I got an electrical engineering degree at Auburn. And I was in ROTC, so as I completed my years at Auburn, this is Colonel Merritt, who pinned on my second lieutenant bars. I went to pilot training out in Arizona. Really enjoyed pilot training, worked hard at it, enjoyed the class, and I did really well. I was able to finish near the top of my class, and I owe a lot of that success to my instructor, Brian Weatherly here. I kept in touch with him through the years. An excellent instructor. So I was able to choose my assignment. I chose the RF-4. I was interested in photography, but also interested in airplanes, so I chose the RF-4, and that was before F-15s and F-16s were available to new pilots. I really enjoyed flying the F-4 Phantom for 9 years. Its mission was high-speed, low-altitude photography. We'd fly in below enemy radar. But it was a great experience. And then after 5.5 years in the RF-4, this is my RF-4 unit over in Okinawa. I'm kneeling on the far right-hand side, but I'm really proud of all these guys. I've kept in close contact with all of these guys except for 2 who have passed away. The tall guy on the far left, Lieutenant Chilton, I'm really extra proud of him. He eventually became a 4-star general. He was this STRATCOM commander when he retired in 2011. But he's been really good to keep up his friendship with the rest of us, even though he vastly outranks us. Then I transferred to the F-4 fighter, the F-4E. Really enjoyed flying the fighter and learning how to deliver ordnance accurately. I never was in combat, but we trained really hard for combat to be ready in case we were called for combat. Really enjoyed training for combat. Especially enjoyed the tactics of air-to-air combat. And my flight commander in the fighter is Jim Anderson, standing behind his dad there. This picture was made just a couple of years ago. Jim Anderson was my flight commander. His dad, Bud Anderson, just passed away last year. He was the last living triple ace. So he was a triple ace, 16 kills, German kills over during World War II, Bud Anderson. Then after a total of 9 years flying the Phantom, I was finally selected to fly the SR-71 Blackbird. Loved flying the airplane. It's an exciting plane. It's all been declassified now, so I can tell you all about the airplane. As soon as I got to the Beale Air Force Base in 1983, Chuck Yeager showed up at the base. He had gotten some publicity in the movie The Right Stuff that came out in 1983, and so one of the high-ranking generals gave him permission to get a Blackbird flight. So Maury Rosenberg gave him a Blackbird flight soon after I got to Beale Air Force Base in 1983. So Chuck Yeager spoke to us there in the squadron. Really enjoyed talking to him. You know, he's the first guy to fly supersonic. he broke the sound barrier for the first time ever in 1947. That's General Chuck Yeager. He just passed away a couple of years ago at age 97. The airplane is built to be the world's fastest, highest flying airplane. I can tell you now that the top altitude on the airplane was 85,000 feet. The maximum speed was Mach 3.3. We were not allowed to fly faster than 3.2 unless we were under attack. Then we could push it up to 3.3. But the airplane got its best fuel economy at Mach 3.17. Most of our missions were flown at Mach 3. 85,000 feet, Mach 3.3, and that's faster than a rifle bullet, faster than muzzle velocity of a 30-06 rifle bullet. Now the speed of sound is dependent only on temperature, this formula here. You would think it would be dependent on air pressure and density also, but it's not. It's just dependent on, the speed of sound in air is just dependent on the square root of the temperature in degrees Kelvin. So down near the ground on a typical day like today, the speed of sound might be about 760 miles an hour, but up where we were flying around 80,000 feet, the air's a lot colder. The air molecules are bouncing around slower, so the speed of sound is slower. The speed of sound at near 80,000 feet is typically 660 miles per hour. So if you multiply that times Mach 3.3, that's almost 2,200 miles an hour, 36 miles per minute, or about 1 mile every 1.65 seconds. Now, if we were flying, you didn't have the sensation of speed. You didn't see clouds flying by the cockpit because we were well above any weather. So you didn't have the sensation of speed, but we had miles to go to the next turn point, and those miles were clicking by a second, where they were clicking by a mile every 1.65 seconds. Now, you know, the boat leaves a wake in the water, and a supersonic airplane will leave a three-dimensional wake in the air, a shock wave. So it's a three-dimensional wake, a cone. So everybody that's under that cone, as we fly over them, when whoever's under that cone will all of a sudden hear boom, and sometimes they'll hear a double boom from a shock wave off the nose and a shock wave off the wings. I flew the SR-71, which is a two-seat Blackbird. We had a backseater, RSO, Reconnaissance Systems Officer, in the back seat. Now, the early version Blackbirds were A-12s that were built, first flew in 1962. The SR-71 first flew 2 years later in 1964. Now, in front of the Rocket Center has been a A-12 Blackbird, and a single seat. You'll notice that plane does not have the window behind the cockpit, so that's the easiest way to tell the difference in the SR-71 and the A-12. As I passed by the Rocket Center on the way over, I drove from Florence, up from Florence, Alabama. I noticed that the Blackbird was not sitting in front of the Rocket Center like I'm used to seeing, and I heard that it's being renovated or repainted, and it's under looked like it's underneath a canvas shelter. So that's exciting that it's being renovated over there. Now, Alabama's got 3 Blackbirds, more than any other state except for California. We have a Blackbird here in Huntsville. There's one in the Air Museum in Birmingham, and then the airplane hangar near the USS Alabama in Mobile has a Blackbird, and an A-12. All 3 of them are A-12s here in Alabama. Now, the Blackbirds were built by the Skunk Works section of Lockheed. This is one of my heroes, Kelly Johnson, the primary Blackbird designer. He led the team that designed the Blackbird. I read his autobiography, and it's a really interesting autobiography. He had a fascinating life. And he grew up in a low-income family. He was number 7 of 9 kids in the upper peninsula of Michigan. As a kid, he was interested in Tom Swift books and read all those books, and he says that's how he got his inspiration to be an airplane designer. He wanted to be like Tom Swift. So he was raised in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He did not become a pilot, but he as an airplane test engineer, he got flights in most all the airplanes that he designed. Became friends with his stepson, John Horrigan, and John showed me Kelly Johnson's scrapbook that young Kelly made when he was 13 years old. Now, Kelly Johnson was born in 1910, so when he was 13, that was 1923, and this is the scrapbook that he put together, young Kelly Johnson. These are some of young Kelly's drawings, and these would have been state-of-the-art airplanes back in 1923. Got a special kick out of this article. It's an article saying that the French have just taken the airplane speed record from the Americans and at 278 miles an hour. But you can notice he's got notice for those exclamation points. You can just imagine young Kelly thinking, that is just unacceptable, and I'm going to design an airplane someday that will take the speed limit, and he did. So his airplanes, Blackbird, still has the absolute speed limit for an airplane, which now is 2,193 miles an hour. And that speed record has existed since 1976. I'm sorry, 1976. Besides being an outstanding engineer, he was also an outstanding manager. So he was able to manage the team that built the Blackbird. I'll show you just a few of his designs. The P-38, World War II P-38, which was really remarkable. Our top aces over during World War II got all their kills with Kelly Johnson's P-38. This is Dick Bong. He had our top ace in World War II. He had 40 kills with the P-38. And here he's talking to Tom McGuire. Tom McGuire was the second leading ace in World War II. With 38 kills, all his kills were with the P-38. And by the way, the P-38 also shot down Admiral Yamamoto, who was the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941. So Kelly designed America's first operational jet fighter, the F-80 Shooting Star, and that our first jet made the front cover of Life magazine back in 1945. He designed the F-104, America's first Mach 2 airplane. He designed the U-2 spy plane that was shot down over Russia in 1960, May 1st of 1960. I was 11 years old, and it was all in the papers how the plane had been shot down over Russia, and they took our pilot captive, Francis Gary Powers, for a couple of years. He was a prisoner, and we finally got him back through a prisoner swap. And so Kelly decided he would design a plane that was going to be too high and too fast to be shot down. His crowning achievement, the beautiful and at the time mysterious SR-71 Blackbird. The main challenges in designing the airplane was heat. So Mach 3, the friction with the air causes the airplane to get really hot. Average temperature of 550 degrees Fahrenheit. But aluminum alloys, which airplanes are made out of, gets too soft at that high temperature, so they had to design the airplane and build the airplane primarily with titanium. And you can see titanium is one of the lightest of the transition metals, and that lightweight titanium can take that high temperature. The airplane was designed primarily using slot rules back in the early 1960s. Now, my engineering class in 1972 was one of the last engineering classes to use only slide rules, and then just a couple of years after that, little handheld calculators became cheap enough that students could use them. And I've got a little TI-84 now, and I'm just amazed at what all that little TI-84 can do compared to our slide rules back in the 60s. Now the airplane was famous for leaking fuel. The fuel was special fuel, JP7 fuel. It had a real high flash point, so they say that it was not dangerous having all that fuel under the airplane. They said you could hold a match to the fuel and you couldn't light it. Now, I never did actually try that, but that's what they were claiming. Bob Gilliland was the very first test pilot to fly the airplane. He first flew the SR-71 December the 22nd, 1964. Bob was from Memphis, and even though 22 years older than me, he became one of my best friends and really good friends with Bob. He passed away at age 93 in 2019. You see the chine area of the airplane, and the chine, that flared area there, held some of the sensors and cameras, but also the airplane had, the shape of the airplane had early stealth technology, so you can see that there are very few rounded edges that would reflect a radar wave directly back to the transmitter. The engines were 34,000 pounds of thrust apiece, J58 Pratt & Whitney engines. The engines are really fascinating. That's the compressor blades for the engine. Our technicians did a great job maintaining our engines. Now in the middle you see those two black tubes. Now there were 6 of those black tubes that routed compressed air around the combustion chamber. As we accelerated through Mach 2, valves would open and route some of the compressed air from compressor stage number 4 around the combustion chamber and directly into the afterburner. So it gave the engine a partial ramjet quality. So it was not a true ramjet, but it had a ramjet quality because of the compressed air routed around the combustion chamber and directly into the afterburner. That's the afterburner section of that engine. With the afterburners going, there were bright spots in the exhaust caused by supersonic waves in the exhaust. In front of each engine was a cone, spike we call it, the inlet, and the inlet was really fascinating. As we accelerated, the spike would withdraw into the inlet as much as 26 inches during the acceleration, and position the shock wave in just the right position in the throat of the inlet. So the air on the right-hand side of the shock wave was subsonic because the air was being compressed just due to the speed of the airplane. And as the air was compressed suddenly with the speed of the airplane, the temperature became really hot on the right-hand side of the shock wave, and it would approach 800 degrees Fahrenheit before it even entered the engine. We had a phenomenon called the unstart. We would be flying along and that shock wave would get spit out the front, and it felt like a sudden explosion. It was not dangerous, but it sure got your attention. You'd be flying along and all of a sudden, boom, and you'd have a sudden yaw on the airplane because it lost about 80% of the thrust on that side. The computers would send the spikes full forward and open the bypass doors and reset the spikes indoors, and you'd be off and running again in about 15 seconds. If the computers didn't restart the inlets properly and you had repeated unstarts, we had controls in the cockpit. We could set the spike position and the bypass doors manually with controls in the cockpit, but we were not able to run the inlet as efficiently as the computers could, so normally we let the computers run the inlet. Our mission was reconnaissance, so we took pictures in hostile areas of the world, keeping a close watch on countries that might start hostilities. Our primary camera was carried in the nose of the airplane. When I started flying the airplane in 1983, we were starting to use ASARs, synthetic aperture radar, as one of our primary sensors instead of the optical camera. So with that ASARs, we could get pictures using radar that was almost as good a resolution as an optical camera. It shows some of the sensors that was carried by the airplane. Now with that ASARs, it made us more useful because we could get pictures at night and through the weather. We were based at Beale Air Force Base, north of Sacramento, California. We also had U-2 airplanes at the base. On the right-hand side, you see those real wide hangars are U-2 hangars, and then the narrow hangars toward the front of the picture were housing the SR-71 Blackbirds. We operated from Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, Beale Air Force Base just north of Sacramento, and then Mildenhall Air Force Base over in England. So from those three places, we flew our worldwide reconnaissance missions. We were all based at Beale, but then we would be sent TDY, temporary duty, to Okinawa for 6 weeks, and then back to Beale, and then 6 weeks over to Mildenhall, England, and back to Beale, rotating like that. In Beale, we also flew the little T-38. The T-38 was also a joy to fly, and it was a lot cheaper to fly than the Blackbird. So between Blackbird flights, we would fly the T-38, practice our instrument procedures, formation work, and aerobatics. The pictures that I have of the Blackbird while in flight were taken primarily with the T-38s flying in loose formation with the Blackbird when it was close to the base. We flew the Blackbird with the pressure suits because our most efficient cruising speed and altitude was near 80,000 feet at Mach 3.17. So our cockpit was pressurized to equivalent of 25,000 feet. But if we were to lose cockpit pressure, and if you're above 63,000 feet, you don't have enough pressure on your body and your blood starts to boil. And so, it always burns your whole day whenever your blood starts boiling. So we wore a pressure suit as a safety backup to losing cockpit pressure. Now, because our cockpit was at 25,000 feet, we had to breathe pure oxygen during the flight. So those are the oxygen leads for our flight. We had two bottles of liquid oxygen that supplied our needs during the flight. And we also had a small oxygen bottle in our survival kit in case we had to bail out. Now this was Kurt Osterhill. I was crewed with Kurt for a couple of years. He was my RSO for a couple of years. He was from Wisconsin, a great guy. I really enjoyed flying with Kurt. On a typical flight, we would be driven out to the airplane in this van, and then we might get there any time of day or night. It was just a coincidence. We got there just as the sun was coming up over the horizon. And then now the sun is shining into the hangar, and our pressure suit experts would get us all hooked up to our seat belt and survival kit, parachute, air hoses for our pressure suit, oxygen for our helmet, and communications leads, microphone and speakers for our helmet, and our parachute. Now this is this 1960s cockpit. They updated the airplane through the years with more modern computers, digital computers, more modern sensors, and various other modern things for the airplane, but they never felt the need to update the pilot displays. Those 1960s displays for the pilot worked just fine. We would start the engines in the hangar, do our pre-flight checks in the hangar, taxi out, and it was always really exciting taxiing out with the Blackbird because you knew something pretty special was about to happen. This amazing airplane was going to take you right up to the edge of space at 3 times faster than sound, so you knew something pretty special was about to happen. taxi onto the runway. Lit the afterburners. There's always a real kick in the pants when the afterburners would light. Accelerate rapidly down the runway. Lift the nose at 180 knots and lift off at 210 knots. Climb out at 400 knots. And then 2 minutes after brake release, we would be leveling off at 25,000 feet to air refuel. It seems funny that we'd air refuel first thing, but we always took off with only half a load of fuel for safety reasons, because if we were fully loaded with fuel, taking off and just lifting off and lost an engine, might not be able to control the airplane slow and low like that. So for safety, we took off half loaded of fuel, climbed to 25,000 feet, air refueled a full load of fuel. There, if we were to lose an engine, we were going fast enough and high enough that we could bring the airplane back safely and land it. Held 12,000 gallons of fuel. Our fuel gauge was in pounds, so we held 80,000 pounds of fuel, which is about 12,000 gallons. So that picture's made from the boomer's pod and the tanker. They're refueling behind the tanker. Now, just forward of the refueling receptacle, you see that round window there. Underneath that round window is a little telescope. Now, our airplane for navigation had inertia navigation, which most all airplanes have now, inertia navigation. And nowadays, inertia navigation is updated with GPS signals. But back in the 60s, inertia navigation systems were updated with radio signals from the ground. But we couldn't depend on the Russians to give us good radio signals for our navigation. So for our updating the navigation was done by a little telescope. So the backseater would dial in what day of the year we were flying the mission. So and there was a real accurate clock in the system so the computer knew where the Earth was in its revolution around the sun and knew where the Earth was in its rotation. So the telescope knew where to look for a star, and it would look for a star and then do a circular search until it found the star, lock on and measure that angle, and keep doing that repeatedly through the flight. And that's how the inertia navigation system was updated through the flight. I always thought that was pretty fascinating, early 60s technology. So after refueling, we would light the afterburners. It took about 20 minutes to climb to our initial cruise altitude of about 75,000 feet. That's what it looked like at 75,000 feet. And we would do a cruise climb during the flight. So as we got lighter, we were more efficient being higher. So we would gradually be climbing during the flight to be at the best altitude for our weight to get max efficiency for our fuel. We had a lot of missions around the Arctic Circle area along the northern border of the Soviet Union, keeping a watch on the submarines and what's being loaded on those submarines, nuclear missiles targeted for the United States. So the Blackbird was only one of several ways to keep up with where those Soviet submarines were. So here, this picture was made in the springtime, and you see the Arctic ice breaking up. And you know the shortest distance from the Soviet Union to the United States was over the North Pole area. So that's why they had submarines along the Arctic Circle. It was interesting flying along the Arctic Circle, especially in the wintertime. The day-night line runs almost east and west at noontime in the Arctic Circle region. So our mission might take us back and forth across the day-night line several times, and we weren't concerned with where daylight was when we were using that ASAR's camera. So we might see several sunrises and sunsets. Just happened on one mission. It was just a coincidence. I crossed the day-night line 6 times in less than an hour, and so in less than an hour's time, I'd seen 3 sunsets and 3 sunrises. That's the planet Venus, just above the horizon there. Then at the end of the mission, at the end of the supersonic leg, we might refuel and do another supersonic leg, or might bring it back to our base. And here We're on final approach for landing, put the landing gear down and fly final approach at 175 knots, flare and touchdown at 155 knots, deploy that big arms drag chute, get us slowed down in a big hurry. And then we taxi into toward the hangar, raise the canopies. It was always a great feeling of satisfaction after every Blackbird mission, because not only had we just flown the world's fastest, highest flying airplane, but best of all, we felt like we'd just done something really important for our country and for the cause of freedom. So it was always a great feeling of satisfaction after every Blackbird mission. After a couple of years of flying the Blackbird, they asked me to be one of the instructors, so I upgraded to be an instructor. We had 2 trainers, and one of the trainers was crashed in the 1970s. So after the 1970s, we only had 1 trainer, and so I was trained to be the instructor in the back seat for somebody new in the airplane. That trainer, the SR-71B trainer, is on display at the Air Museum in Kalamazoo, Michigan now. Kalamazoo, Michigan, their museum is called the Air Zoo. I thought that was a pretty clever name for an air museum, the Air Zoo. So it was always an honor to train somebody in the Blackbird, in the trainer there. Here I had just instructed Jim Hossell on his very first Mach 3 flight, and already spent a lot of time with him and training him in the simulator. The other guys come out and congratulate him on his first Mach 3 flight. Wing Commander pins on his Mach 3 pin. And these are the patches that we wore on our green flight suits, the Mach 3 patch and Habu patch. The Habu name is another nickname for the airplane. The Okinawans thought that our long, sleek, black airplane reminded them of their black, very poisonous snake, and so they started calling the Blackbird the Habu over there, and that name caught on, and so it's known almost as well as a Habu as it is a Blackbird. Then, after 2 more years flying the Blackbird, one of the 2 test pilot positions came open down at Palmdale, and so I applied and was very fortunate to get selected to be one of the 2 test pilots on the SR-71. So we had 2 test pilot Blackbird, testing the Blackbird, and then 2 test RSOs. And in the middle is Ben Rich. Ben Rich took over the Skunk Works after Kelly Johnson retired. So it was very satisfying testing new things for the new systems, sensors and materials for the airplane, and testing changes in the software. Very, very interesting and satisfying. Now, Palmdale is real close to Edwards Air Force Base, which you see underneath the airplane there. Edwards Air Force Base, built right on the edge of Rogers Dry Lake, 10-mile-long dry lake, natural hard surface, and that's why Edwards has been the premier test center for airplanes since the 1940s. So if you're testing an airplane and the engine's quit, you can just glide right down and land on that 10-mile-long hard surface Rogers Dry Lake. Now, in the early 80s, they put black lines on Rogers Dry Lake for the space shuttle, so the space shuttle first landings were on Rogers Dry Lake. And then they started landing the shuttle on the concrete at Edwards, and then finally started landing it at Cape Kennedy. So we'd go out there and watch the shuttle land out at Edwards, and then a few days later watch it taxi out on its flight back to Cape Kennedy on the back of that big 747, which is always a great sight to see. Then sadly, even though we've been testing new things for the airplane for 2 years, Congress voted to retire the Blackbird in the fall of 1989. We sure were disappointed. We love flying the airplane, and we're excited about the new things that we've been testing for the airplane, but to save money, Congress decided to retire the airplane, and plus there had been advances in spy satellites. So spy satellites were able to do a lot of the missions that we were able to do. So Lockheed asked us to fly by their employees at Lockheed down at Burbank. Now the Skunk Works was at Burbank at that time. It has since been moved up to Palmdale, but Ben Rich asked the Blackbird to make a couple of passes for the employees down there, and I got to do that, and it sure was an honor to fly in front of all those Lockheed employees, engineers, and who had devoted so much of their time and energy to developing things for the Blackbird, as well as new airplanes, other new airplanes. I never got to meet my hero, Kelly Johnson, because he had some light strokes, but Ben Rich told me that they brought Kelly Johnson out in his wheelchair to watch us fly by, and he said that Kelly Johnson had tears in his eyes as we flew by and departed. That was going to be the retirement of the Blackbird. So I didn't get to meet him, but I got to fly in front of Kelly Johnson. Our commander invited Air Force families to come up and watch one of the last missions, one of the last test missions of the Blackbird. Now the museums all over the country wanted Blackbirds for display, and so the Smithsonian was allowed to get tail number 972, and the Smithsonian wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Air Force and said, when your pilot brings the airplane to the Smithsonian, would you have him set an official coast-to-coast airplane speed record, and that will call the public's attention to what a great airplane it's been for our country for 25 years. And down at the bottom it says, I hope that you will find it appropriate to order that the last flight of the Blackbird attempt a coast-to-coast record. So I was ordered to set a speed record. So I was very fortunate to get to fly that speed record flight. Don Emmons called me and said, "Yeah, I want you and JTV to take 972 to the Smithsonian and work with the NAA, the agency that monitors and verifies official airplane speed records. Work with them and set an official record. I'm giving you permission to fly Mach 3.3. Ordinarily, we weren't allowed to fly faster than 3.2. Fly 3.3 for that cruise across the United States." And he said, you can talk to the media afterwards and say that that you had just flown sea to shining sea in just over an hour. And so, sea to shining sea, is a famous phrase in that America the Beautiful song, one of my favorite hymns. And so it got me thinking about that hymn, America the Beautiful. JT and I felt very, very fortunate to get to fly that flight. It really could have made by any of the crews that were current in the airplane. We just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Plus, we were both very senior on the airplane. So this was our plan. We'd take off from Palmdale, fly up towards San Francisco, John, with two KC-135 tankers and air refuel going south. And then we would light the afterburners and get a 200-mile running start toward the west coast. And the NAA would get our time as we crossed the west coast and get our time across the east coast. And that would be and then we would turn around and land at Dulles. Now, fuel was really tight for that long flight, so we didn't have enough fuel to cross the west coast at top speed and the east coast at top speed. So we had to plan it crossing the west coast, accelerating through Mach 2.5, and then pull it out of afterburner as we approached Washington, D.C., and across the east coast at about descending through Mach 2.5. Then we would turn around and land at Dulles with the bare minimum required fuel reserve. Now, Ben Rich was also interested in the Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. record. And so you would think that a city-to-city record ought to be from takeoff to landing, but that's not how they do them. The NAA will get your time as you pass by one city at speed, and then get your time passing the other city at speed. So we were able to do 3 city-to-city records at the same time that we were doing a coast-to-coast record. Let's see, so on March the 6th of 1990, we briefed our last SR-71 flight. In the wee hours of the morning, March the 6th of 1990, our last Blackbird flight. So while we were briefing, maintenance was getting our airplane ready to fly. Then we suited up one last time, put our pressure suits on, and making sure my pressure suit's going to hold pressure properly in case we lost cockpit pressure. Check my microphone and speakers, and making sure that all that's working properly. And then we taxied out at 4:15 in the morning Pacific time, which was 7:15 in the morning. We're in Washington, where we're going to take the airplane. Took off at 4:30 in the morning Pacific time, flew up to San Francisco, joined with those tankers. And it was pitch dark out there that night. There was no moon, no horizon, but we had refueled at night many, many times. We got a full load of fuel, lit the afterburners, and that's what it would have looked like to our tanker crew as we departed, except it was still pitch dark out there, so that picture was not made that night. It was still pitch dark, but that gives you an idea of what our afterburners would have looked like to the tanker crews as we banked them and accelerated away toward the west coast. That's what it did look like as we were accelerating through Mach 2.5, crossing the west coast at 2.5. And we're flying faster than a bullet toward the sun, so the sun's coming up rapidly. And it was just bright enough that I could see white ocean breakers all along the California coastline, so it was really, really pretty. But it was still dark enough that I could see the millions of lights of Los Angeles down below, and off to my left I could see the lights of San Francisco 300 miles away, and to my right I could see the lights of San Diego, all the lights of San Diego to my right, and then the darkness of Mexico beyond that. Really a pretty sight. Now, it's faster than a bullet toward the sun, so the sun is up rapidly, and here we're passing Las Vegas. You can see the entire city of Las Vegas at the top. Lake Mead down below. A few minutes later, we're going right by the Grand Canyon in Arizona, passed by the Purple Mountain Majesties as described in America the Beautiful of southwest Colorado. Then we passed about 60 miles south of Pikes Peak, it was from the top of Pikes Peak where Catherine Bates was inspired to write that wonderful song, America the Beautiful, in the late 1800s. Then a few minutes later, we're right over that fruited plain in her song, America the Beautiful. Hundreds of miles of prime American farmland. This was a special flight, so I was having special thoughts, and I was thinking about all those thousands of farmers down there starting their day raising food that feeds most of the citizens in our country, and even enough food to export overseas. Thought about our brave pioneers that I remember reading about as a boy, taking months to cross country that JT and I were crossing in just a matter of minutes. Thought about what a great country we have, made great by the hard work and sacrifices and prayers of our forefathers through the years. The eastern part of our country was undercast, so I didn't see many features in the eastern part of our country, but JT and I just made sure we enjoyed our last few minutes flying the airplane, one last view of God's earth from 80,000 feet. The curvature of the earth is like the bright band of blue on the horizon because we're above 97% of the air molecules, the darkness overhead. Thought about how fortunate we were to have flown alongside and served alongside hundreds of highly dedicated men and women who served with the Blackbird for 25 years. And most of all, we just made sure we enjoyed our last few minutes of flying that marvelous, marvelous airplane. Then we crossed the East Coast the Blackbird had just flown sea to shining sea faster than any airplane has before or since. And so that speed record, that coast-to-coast speed record, still stands now after 35 years, 67 minutes and 54 seconds. Now the NAA gave the news media an initial estimate of something over 68 minutes, so that 68 minutes appeared in a lot of newspapers the next day and in the news that night. But they went back and reviewed the tapes and decided 67 minutes, 54 seconds is the correct time, and that's the time that's in the airplane speed record book. So we are headed back toward Dulles, and we planned to land at Dulles with just the bare minimum required fuel, but they wanted me to make a couple of passes for the crowd, so they had a tanker there. They gave me just a little bit more fuel so I could make a couple of passes for the crowd. We backed away from that tanker and then made our first pass at 800 feet. They wanted one at 800 feet and then one at 200 feet. So then I circled around and made a pass at 200 feet and lit the afterburner, abeamed the crowd so they could feel the power of those two big J-58 engines and see the beautiful sight of those orange plumes behind that beautiful black airplane. And that's the same picture that was on the front page of the Washington Post the very next morning, March the 7th of 1990, and a nice article about the retirement of the Blackbird. We touched down, deployed that big orange drag chute one last time, taxiing into the Dulles terminal. Somebody had hung a big American flag on the tower of the terminal. I really appreciated that patriotic gesture. You can see the wind has got it inverted in that picture, but I really appreciated whoever mounted the flag on the tower. Then we had our maintenance troops from Palmdale there to chalk our wheels and prepare the airplane for handover to the Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian. Climbed out of the cockpit, and I'll never forget the feelings. You know, we were just excited. We just set some speed records, but mostly feeling sad because that was going to be our last flight in the Blackbird, the last time we'd get to fly the Blackbird, and be the last time that beautiful black airplane will ever fly. So we're mostly feeling sad about it. Ben Rich was there to give us a big thumbs up signal. And then there was a plane side ceremony as the Air Force passed the airplane over to the Smithsonian. That's Dr. Harwood, who wrote that letter requesting a coast-to-coast speed record, talking about how glad he was to have the airplane for display. That's Ben Rich talking about how the Blackbird had served our country for 25 years and the great job it had done. So they presented JT and me with coast-to-coast speed record certificates, which we really appreciated, but we both know that it's really the Blackbird speed record. We're just lucky to get to be the crew. And this was a surprise. I knew Mom and Dad were going to be there, but I sure didn't expect them to be out on the ramp. But somebody found out who they were and took them out on the ramp to hug my neck. Mom and Dad from Florence, Alabama. They were both raised in Florence. They're two of my main heroes. They were real heroes. They were teenagers during the Great Depression. Dad went right into the Navy after he graduated from high school, right into World War II. He was in World War II out in the Pacific for 3 years. And then he went to school on the GI Bill and became a TVA engineer and had a great career with TVA for 35 years. Mom got her nursing certificate while he was off in the war, and then became a school teacher in the Florence area. And then when my aunt and uncle were killed in a car wreck, they took in 4 of those kids, and I was already the oldest of 5, so they had us 5 and then 4 more of my cousins to raise. And so they were real heroes, Mom and Dad. Besides, great parents also had excellent public school teachers, and we had a really good active church youth group and an outstanding Boy Scout troop. So I just feel very fortunate to have grown up in North Alabama. Then we answered questions from the news media about flying the Blackbird. And then on TVs all across the nation that night, a short newscast about the record-setting flight.
Be a victim of the Pentagon budget cutting, but the SR-71 reconnaissance plane is not going quietly. It was the sonic boom you heard in the San Fernando Valley this morning, as John Marshall reports.
This story begins here. Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects, better known as the Skunk Works. In the early 60s, Kelly Johnson and a team of engineers set out to build a plane that would fly faster than a speeding bullet. And that it has, for 25 years. The story ended early this morning at Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale. Lieutenant Colonels Raymond Yeilding and J.B. Vita put on their spacesuits for one last historic flight. Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, coast to coast, Los Angeles to Washington. The SR-71, the Blackbird, can cruise at 2,200 miles an hour, 16 miles above the Earth, because its titanium skin can withstand operating temperatures of more than 800 degrees. Flying faster and higher than anything else, the spy plane has never been shot down. After takeoff, the Blackbird was refueled by an Air Force tanker plane, then pointed east, as the two J-58 engines were cranked up to maximum cruising thrust. The sonic boom rocked the Los Angeles area just after 6 a.m. The SR-71 did everything it was supposed to do, arriving at Washington's Dulles International Airport 1 hour, 8 minutes, and 32 seconds later, shattering the old record. Average speed, 2,112 miles an hour.
But like every good thing, it must come to an end. So let me say and conclude by saying goodbye to this magnificent, sophisticated flying machine. Bye-bye, Blackbird.
John Marshall, Channel 4 News.
Brings back good memories. But then we had to make our way back to our base in California. So our JP and I our seats were right in the center of this big, huge United Airlines 767, right between the two aisles of that plane. And it was a good flight and all, and the service was nice, but gosh, it took 5 hours to get back to California. This represents the retirement of the Blackbird. These are our records: coast to coast, 67 minutes, 54 seconds. LA to DC, 64 minutes, 20 seconds. And then Kansas City to DC, 25 minutes, 59 seconds. St. Louis to Cincinnati, 8 minutes, 32 seconds. Now the St. Louis to Cincinnati had the highest average speed, because that's the only, of the 4 records, that's the only record that we were able to be at our cruise speed at over that entire distance. 2,190 miles an hour average speed for that part of it. Okay, the airplane is now on display at the Udvar-Hazy Center, just close to Dulles Airport. It's displayed right in the center of the museum, and then behind you see the Space Shuttle Discovery in the distance there. It's a nice museum. They've got JT Vita's, my backseater, his suit is on display close to the airplane. And they have my pressure suit on display at the Airspace Museum in the air near the Capitol, which is really an honor too. Now the Udvar-Hazy Center, fascinating. Well, both museums are the Udvar-Hazy Center and also the Airspace Museum close to the Capitol. They're both great museums. Spend hours easily in there. I'll show you quickly what I flew after the Blackbird. Flew this little C-20 out of Andrews Air Force Base. We're flying VIPs out of our federal government to wherever their duty required throughout the world. Flew that little airplane all over the world. And then while I was doing that, my backseater JT Vita had got cancer and passed away only 2.5 years after our speed record flight. We sure miss him. He was a great friend, outstanding RSO, and he had more time in the Blackbird than any other crew member in history. As he had 1,392 hours in the Blackbird. Then a year after he passed away, my dad passed away, and I thought, well, I'm going to retire from the Air Force and fly for the airlines and be based in Memphis so I could get home and help Mom with things a lot more often than I was able to while I was in the service. I enjoyed being an airline pilot for 13 years, enjoyed the other Northwest pilots that I flew with. And then I was able to get enough seniority to fly the DC-10, and finally had enough seniority to be the most junior first officer on the 747-400, which also an engineering marvel. Really enjoyed flying that 747. Here I'm flying with Stu Popwell. It had a more modern cockpit than I'd ever flown with before. Stu is also from Alabama, but he has since passed away also with a heart attack. Then my last year as an airline pilot, Delta acquired Northwest Airlines, so I flew the 747 with Delta colors before I retired. Here I'm standing beside the big wheels of that big 747. The 747 had 18 wheels, so I guess you could say I retired on an 18-wheeler. I really enjoyed my 13 years with the airline. But then after I retired, I still wanted to fly, so I bought this little Citabria, and it's really fun to fly. I enjoy anything that flies. One problem is I'm having to pay for my own gasoline now. So that's really my last slide, but I'd like to, I'll tell you that we're not sure what the future will bring, but this is the model that was made for the movie Top Gun Maverick. So that's not a real airplane yet, but we just wonder what might lie ahead. And they are building a supersonic transport in so I think it's Greensboro, South Carolina. I'm not sure. But its top speed is supposed to be Mach 1.7 and will be hauling passengers. So that's exciting. That's in the works. We're just not sure what the future will bring for aviation. So it's exciting to think about what might lie ahead. I want to close with this 5-minute video of Kelly Johnson. It's a tribute to Kelly Johnson. Kelly Johnson's the main hero in this whole story. It was a film that was unofficial film that was put together by one of the Lockheed assistant cameramen, but he did such a good job of it that it's often shown with the Blackbird. An unofficial tribute to Kelly Johnson.